Ireland currently collects about 31.3% of GDP in taxation. Eurostat defines a country as low tax if it collects up to 34.9% of GDP in taxation. So we're proposing that we bridge the gap and move from collecting approximately 31% of GDP in taxation to 34.9% of GDP. So we have a tax gap at the moment of about €6.7 billion over the next 5 years because our Department of Finance projections show us still maintaining the steady, very low rate of around 31.3 to 31.9% of GDP being collected in taxation. So overall, we propose looking at the tax base as a whole. In Ireland, we rely heavily on income tax, VAT and PRSI to make up the bulk of our exchequer and taxation income. So we need to move towards things like looking at the corporation tax, not necessarily the headline rate, but looking at introducing a minimum effective rate so that every corporation pays at least a certain amount of their profits in taxation in Ireland. Obviously, this issue is being looked at by the OECD and the base erosion profit shifting process also. But in order to increase our taxation, we also have to be able to tell people what we're going to spend that money on. You know, what is your taxation going to go towards? Things like social services. How do we address the gaps in our social services and the social services we're going to need in years to come? You know, we're going to have a growing population, but also an aging population. Fiscal stability is very important. We need to reduce our debt, but also look at how we're going to get Ireland on a fiscally sustainable footing going forward. Taxation, you mentioned there as we propose increasing the tax take, but we need to look at broadening the tax base. Look at things like environmental taxation, accounting for our natural resources. If they're being depleted, then who is depleting them, and how do they compensate for this? And making sure that those at the lowest end of the income spectrum are not the ones who are hit by this taxation. The taxation system should be progressive, so that the more you earn, obviously the higher the taxation you can afford to pay, and that's just not in the income system, it's overall. And then we also need to look at sustainability and how we incorporate the environment, social sustainability and economic sustainability under all of our policy process. And then this should guide our decisions on, where do we invest the extra money from taxation in? We have deficits in our public transport services, and our health services, and in terms of provision of childcare and also early childhood education and care. Elder care, we have deficits there, so we need to plan for this. Long-term planning is required. We're not going to solve these problems over a number of years, and we have to clearly be able to communicate to people this is what the money is being spent on and these are the outcomes we hope to achieve. If you look at the statistics, it's a U curve. There isn't a squeeze middle. The top and the bottom have lost the most, but the rest of the curve remains pretty static. But the problem we have in Ireland is that, yes, we're a low tax country, but that means that you have to pay for your services that aren't provided by the state. So people feel squeezed because they're paying for private health insurance. They're paying up to 40% of their income on childcare. They're paying very high rents, especially if you live in urban areas, or there's the issue of the mortgages some of them which were taken out during the boom or prior to the boom, and they're a very heavy burden on families and people at present. So we are a low tax country, and if you look at the effective tax rates, they're low. But the problem is that people are not being provided with public services that you might be provided in other countries. So whatever disposable income that they have after their taxation has been paid and after they've gotten any welfare payments, that is being spent on buying the services that we need. So I think if we need to marry the two, and once people realise that, yes, you may be paying higher taxes or in some form or another, but you won't be spending the money on your private health insurance. You won't be spending that huge chunk of money on childcare. So there are trade-offs, but there are also benefits. But yet that is a challenge to communicate that issue. And I think it's also a challenge to communicate it not just to the general public, but to those in the political process as well, because You know, a lot of people, TDs, and governments seem to think they're incredibly highly taxed as well, where we are a low tax country. But the problem is that people have to spend a huge amount of their income on buying services. We've written quite extensively about this, looking at a deliberative democracy process so that you engage all stakeholders, whether it's at a local, community, regional, or national level, you know, to consider issues based on evidence, and that power differentials are left outside the door. So, in other words, everybody's voice has the same weight around the table, and that you consider policy based on evidence, and you know that ideally that would be a way forward, especially looking at, if you just take health for example, and our demographic projections and the number of people we're going to have aged over 85 in Ireland by 2020 and 2030. Those people are going to need care, and that care will probably have to be provided in the community because that's where people want to be cared for. But then at a community level, everybody needs to sit down with the elected representatives, agencies such as the HSE, those who provide care, and the citizens themselves, and consider, how is this going to be delivered? Then that has to be brought to a regional or a national level. But you need to do this while leaving, for want of a better word, your presuppositions outside the door. And this can't be done just on a political ideology basis as to how you consider things should be delivered. You have to consider things based on the evidence. And then also, if people are involved in the decision-making process, they're more likely to take responsibility for implementing the decisions. But also there needs to be a form of evaluation. I mean, if something isn't working, we must examine why. We shouldn't just say, okay, well, that didn't work, so we're going to do something new. Why did that plan not work, for example? What was it that stopped it working? If we implement something new, are we going to run into the same problems? And if we do, then how do we address those? So, I mean, it's a very long-term process. It's kind of being introduced at a local level with the public participation networks through the local authorities, but they need to be funded. It needs to be rolled out and implemented properly, and obviously those networks need to be supported. So I would see it as a long-term process, but yes, it should be able to deliver real engagement with policy making and people taking responsibility for implementing decisions.